Hola! Welcome to the Live Alive podcast in Cuba. What have you enjoyed most so far?
I just had the best plantains I've ever had in my life. For real.
Plantains.
Dylan, are you having fun yet?
No.
A few months ago, I had this idea. What is it like to live fully present, and how do we actually do that? Can we construct something to live very presently? And I came up with this idea called 24 Hours to Live Alive, which is you go to a place, and in 24 hours, you live as presently as possible to see what happens. If you're really walking with friends and community, and with God, looking around saying, what's available to us? How do we enjoy each other? How do we enjoy where we're at? And we kind of went with this idea. And we did our first one. And we found the cheapest possible international tickets from Orlando. And it was to Havana, Cuba. And so we actually, I timed it on my phone. When we landed, I started the timer. And when we got on the plane, we were there for a total of 24 hours and 34 minutes. So we were in Havana for 24 hours.
Wow, I didn't realize how perfect it was.
It really was perfect. So we want to talk about it, and we want to talk about what we learned, what we experienced, and what we're going to take moving forward. So what are y'all's thoughts?
Well, I really like what you said about being present. I wasn't convinced that this was the right way to go about something like this. It seemed a little crazy to me. But getting to Cuba, and not only just us experiencing it together and going deeper in our friendships, but getting there and living presently with everyone we met. So we were trying to understand. I mean, Cuba is an interesting place with an interesting history, and it's a really important place for Miami and Orlando because a lot of Cubans live here because of the history of Cuba and what's happened there. And so it was really cool to just go and experience that history firsthand, to hear people talk about the revolution in Cuba, but also just to live presently, like you're saying. I think every person we met, we went deep with. Every cab driver, our host, it wasn't that we were trying to do that, but it was us living alive in the moment in Cuba. And I think it's a reflection of what we hope life to be like here in Orlando.
So my mother-in-law asked me, she said, what is Cuba like? And I said, well, it's kind of like the Caribbean and Russia had a baby and then gave it classic cars to play with.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That was 70 years ago, and then nothing has happened.
Oh my gosh. It's literally like stepping into 1950. You get off the plane, all the buildings were built in the 1600s to 1800s, all the cars are from the 50s. It's like stepping into a time machine.
It's like no place I've ever been, right? Because it's also, I mean, like you grew up in Miami, and I lived in Miami for a number of years, and so we have like a lot of friends who are Cubans who have been like personally hurt by the history of that place, and so I think there was some hesitancy in us just for like that reason. It was like,
yeah,
man, there's just some painful history here that have personally affected people that we know and care about. But like going there and walking around in it, like it's just it's an enchanting place, but at the same time it's unsettling.
Well, before we even got on the plane, we were all so slammed with tasks and things that we were doing with family and all of that before we left. It's almost, I didn't even have time to think about it. It was just, well, we're going to Cuba. And in the back of my mind, I had all of these black and white images of like soldiers and revolution, and it was kind of scary, really, just to think about, are we actually going to be able to get into the country, and what's going to happen to us when we get there.
And I think like we had so little time to think about this that I don't think any of us like researched anything. Like I think we really decided to go officially like 2 weeks before we left. we went on journalist visas. So like, I've never in my life been to a place where I'm driving to the airport and I'm like, I'm not really sure if we're going to get in.
I was about 50-50. 50% chance we were coming back to our home once we got to the airport. 50% chance we were getting on the plane.
Because like, we sort of legitimately are journalists. I mean, we're not working for like CNN, but we're like, hey, we have a podcast, which is kind of like a radio show, and it's like we would have had some definite explaining to do that would have been difficult to do. But
in the airport, when we go down to the place where you go through more or less customs, when you're going through, there was almost no one there. There's this huge room in the basement of this airport with about 12 people ready to take customers through. And I walked up to the lady, and she just looked at me, and then she took my passport and asked me if I wanted to have it stamped. And I found out later that a lot of people that travel there don't want their passport stamped with Cuba.
Because
and I was like, man, well, I guess just because...
Family would hate them if they knew.
Well, yeah, it's just because it could be a mark on you going back to the States or whatever.
Yeah, for a long time it was completely restricted from the States. So, like, you wouldn't want your passport stamped with a Cuban stamp because you were not supposed to come there.
When I used to live in Haiti, we had talked about flying from Haiti to Cuba, and we've heard that you could not get it stamped. But then we never did because we're like, is that true? I don't want to get all the way over there and not get it stamped.
Yeah, I just thought, like, how sad to be the person who welcomes people into your country, and the first thing you ask them is, do you even want to be known as someone that was here?
Yeah.
Just it's like not a lack of pride, but just like almost that.
There's a lot of history to Cuba, and we won't go into all that on this podcast, but I think the one piece that is important to understand about Cuba is that the moment Fidel Castro took over in, I think, the 59 or something like that, immediately the government took over all businesses. So if you were an entrepreneur, a doctor, a dentist, if you were a highly skilled culture maker in Cuba, everything was taken from you, your bank account, everything. And so in a matter of months, 100,000 of the most skilled, educated, cultural people in Cuba were in Miami in the 50s.
They just left.
They left. And so think about a society of 11 million people, and the people who basically run your country economically, professionally, are all gone in the blink of an eye. And they're in a city in the United States.
Yeah.
And so Cuba's has kind of been left there without those generations coming after those people.
It's created a really unique situation in Miami too, where like, basically the kids now of that generation are the ones that run Miami. Mm-hmm. They are the ones who shape the culture, who run the government, who are in the highest positions of power in Miami.
Yeah.
So what was the first thing that we did when we got there? Well, we met a Lithuanian.
Yeah, we got to tag along right away.
Yeah,
he's like, where are you guys
was
going?
Hitching a ride.
So we got, basically a bus to drive into Havana with our new Lithuanian friend. And then we left it up to Jeremy to find us a place to eat for lunch right away that didn't exist in two different locations. So we walked to the location where it's supposed to be, and the guy outside's like, yeah, people come by here all the time, and this place doesn't exist. And so we found another location where it might be and walked there.
It gets great reviews on Yelp.
The imaginary restaurant is
Here's what's crazy.
loved.
He lied to us because it's one of the most famous restaurants in the country, and everyone knows about that. It's where the daiquiri was born.
Oh, wait, which one are you talking about?
I'm talking about Floridita, right?
Oh,
No.
Floridita is, we knew what that was.
Yeah. No, this was like on TripAdvisor when I was looking. The number 4 restaurant in Havana was this hole in the wall, like the most authentic Cuban experience you could have.
What was it called?
Somos
Cuba restaurant. And it was like a $1 sign, so it was just like basically street food. But it was a hole in the wall.
It also doesn't exist. So
Yeah.
Chris grabbed some guy walking by and is like, hey, are you Cuban? The guy's like, yeah. And then Chris proceeds to ask him, like, basically, where would you eat for lunch? Or where should we eat for lunch right now? Yeah. And the guy tells us, like 3 blocks up, 2 blocks over type of thing. And the place we end up going to has like, graffiti and like, or basically like people have written their names all over the walls for years.
La
and years
Bodega
and
de
years and
Media. That's what it's called.
And Eddie who's our friend and translator for the trip,
And bodyguard.
and fixer,
An overall comedian.
Yeah, he's given everyone the dollar bill handshake everywhere we go, and basically gets us like.
He's the reason that I literally ran out of money at the end of the trip.
Oh yeah, no, he was given so many money handshakes all throughout Cuba, but
Just as strangers.
just a stranger. But we end up getting in the back of this restaurant upstairs, or like tell him that this big guy out front sent us up there, and there's a bunch of Cuban businessmen. And as soon as we sit down, like this band starts playing. Which,
There was like a 7-piece live band.
they were awesome.
They were awesome.
And it was an incredible meal. And we come to find out that this restaurant is like super famous. There's like paintings of it in other buildings throughout Cuba.
It's where the elite of Cuba eat.
Yeah.
All the top government officials. And
Ernest Hemingway was very famous for having mojitos there, and
Yeah.
supposedly the mojito was invented in the building. But I've read that it was actually invented in like the 1400s by slaves, and it helped prevent scurvy. And so the fact that they're saying it was first made in 1949 at this restaurant is probably subject.
Yeah.
But
By Westerners, it was.
yeah,
Propaganda.
it was invented by Westerners
Yeah.
in 1949.
Yeah,
speaking of propaganda,
Well, great meal. I mean, and just an amazing experience. And then we went and found our Airbnb and like kind of our hosts for the time, which is really cool meeting those guys.
And the ladies.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just walked in, and the building itself was built in 1896. What's crazy, we were talking about, Pez, when we were going to bed that night, is that these buildings in Old Havana were built before planes, before cars. Like, so the streets are super narrow. They're for horses and maybe buggies. And you can go out on the balcony. It was 5 stories tall. You go out on the balcony, and you can just see right into your neighbor's window.
Yeah,
You can
crazy.
see down the street. It was really like a giant movie set, almost, Old Havana. And
It really should be a movie set.
yeah, I mean, it's a very incredible place. And the ceilings were, 15 feet tall? All of them, maybe 18 feet tall. It was huge. And this was before central air conditioning, electricity, all this stuff. But there's something really enchanting about it, because in Old Havana, I mean, when Havana was one of the wealthiest cities in Latin America, I guess, I mean, they had money, and they were building like beautiful architecture. I mean, you were saying that, Chris, right? That you just were really inspired by even the architecture there.
yeah.
And just the time and effort it took into making all this stuff. But now it's kind of dilapidated a little bit, and it has this interesting
a lot
feel.
of it.
A lot of
But what's crazy is even with the dilapidation, it's beautiful.
Oh, totally.
It's got this charm to it. It's like things are falling apart, but there's color everywhere, and the people are amazing. And I don't know, it's weird how
It's
beautiful
this really strange dichotomy of like life and death and brightness and darkness in the same place that I don't feel like you see that intensely many places. Like there's something very sinister about it as well. I mean, there's like a huge amount of sex trafficking, and prostitution is legal, and it's become like this destination for just like gross stuff to happen, which is probably another reason people don't want their their passport stamped.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's so much like vibrancy in the people we talked with, and we actually got to really have real conversations with people who it's like illegal for them to talk with us,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like that's what some of them were saying. Like if you didn't hire me as your driver, I would get stopped by police and like potentially arrested just for talking with you.
That's so
The
crazy.
government controls a lot. And in fact, I would love to talk more about it, but I want to go back.
Yeah.
I want to go back.
I thought what was an interesting part is after we got settled, we got into these 2 classic cars and went to Revolutionary Square. And I thought a very interesting part, like, so y'all know me, I'm pretty naive. I don't really, I'll get into trouble, and y'all, I think the whole trip, everyone was like, Jeremy, no, we can't do
I
that.
feel like you act like you're naive sometimes, but you know what's going on.
Maybe. I don't know. I keep that tucked away in my sleeve. But just going to Revolutionary Square, and apparently this is a big place when the revolution actually took over the country and all that stuff, and there's this huge tower that overlooks the whole city. I thought an ominous sign was when we were at the top of the tower, there's literally buzzards flying everywhere. Y'all remember that?
And there's cameras in like every square inch.
Yes. There's no place where you're not being videoed.
Yeah.
And
I
just
wanted to record the podcast up there, but I realized they're listening.
yeah.
We can't.
And that was the first time, actually, when we saw like the dark fatigues, not only of the people working in the building, but even the military around the building. And it was really interesting because when you look across the street, who were the two people on the 7-story?
Che.
Some other guy.
And then some other guy.
His friend.
We had to ask him about.
But just to see that, and like you were saying, Dylan, it's like a dichotomy of all these feelings because you're seeing like communism, these like concrete slabs of buildings, and then classic cars everywhere, just strolling by down below.
Man.
And they're all, candy colored.
Yeah, it's like individualism versus the collective.
Did we get to see how many miles those cars had on them?
No, I mean,
The odometers were broken.
They were broken.
broke.
30 years
I mean, what do
ago,
you
they were
think?
broken.
Like 3 million miles
Oh,
at
insane.
least?
I mean, they've been driving the streets nonstop for 70 years.
Yeah, not only were the
That's insane to think about.
Yeah.
it is not only were the odometers broken, but there was a lot broken in these cars.
Yeah, the convertible 52 Chevy that we were driving broke down at least 3 times.
One time in a tunnel, and there were massive
terrifying.
buses flying past us at 60 miles per hour. Like, I had my elbow at the car. They were probably like 6 inches from my elbow. I almost lost my arm.
Yeah. Well, one time we were rounding a corner and the door just swung open. The latch didn't work. And you're kind of dependent on it because there's no seatbelt, and you're kind of leaning on it just for some support.
They're these
The door
bouncy
just
old
flies
seats.
open.
Well, even later in the day, as the clouds rolled in, like it just started pouring down rain, and we were in the convertible. They put the top up, but he's like, "Hey, the windows don't go up, and we don't have windshield wipers."
Yeah, so
Cool.
I got a picture like you asked, and it's just pure fog in the window, and the driver can't see anything. And we're just driving around.
But you were literally going 20 miles an hour.
True.
Yeah.
It was like,
We took off.
Yeah.
But Eddie and I were in the back seat, just getting pelted.
yeah.
Dylan wisely got in the car with the top.
Yeah.
Both Dylan and I were very wise.
Wise or lacking the experience of getting soaking wet in Havana one time in your life.
Well, I
I
had
think those are the same thing.
Wise
one
or
shirt,
boring?
one
Wise or
shirt,
boring?
one pair of pants. No.
Yeah. We all packed like nothing. So, well, actually, Jeremy packed nothing. Jeremy literally brought his passport and
Didn't
nothing
even have
else.
a bag.
I told my wife, she was asking me, she's like, "What are you taking?" I was like, "Jen, I've always wanted to go to a country with just my passport and see what happens." So I did.
How'd you brush your teeth with your finger?
I did not. I didn't do anything. I didn't change clothes. I don't know. I had a good time with just my passport. Y'all were lugging around some baggages. But besides that, I had to lean on y'all for some cash and stuff.
Yeah, basically, our bags were filled with your stuff.
Well, what's
So-
funny is when Pez showed up to pick us up at like 6 in the morning or whatever, I asked Pez, "Hey, I've been thinking about doing this. Is this a good idea?" And he was like, "No, don't do that. You need to bring something." And I was
Creature
like,
comforts, man.
"Yeah." And I was like, I want to heed your advice, but I think I got
I'm
to
not
do this."
That's Jeremy's general posture. I want to heed your advice, but I've already decided not to.
Okay, and another way that actually happened was we were in the park after we went to Revolutionary Square, and me and Chris played some football with some youngins, and
Football Americano.
football Americana.
Tackle football.
And they had no idea what they were doing.
No, it was hilarious.
I kept trying to explain to them I was a quarterback, and they were like, "Okay, running back." I'm like, "No, quarterback, throw." And they're like, "Oh, wide receiver."
But as we were leaving, Eddie pointed out there was a military guy who looked very high in the military, and he was like, "Oh, that's a 3-star general." And I was like, "Oh, we should talk to him." And everyone's like, no, don't do that. But I convinced Pez. It doesn't take much to convince Pez, but Pez and Eddie was the one I had to convince because he's our translator to go and
He's
talk
also
to
a
him.
police officer.
He's
so-
also a police officer. To go and talk with him. And even that was just really interesting because he's sitting in the park amongst the people. And when we went and talked to him, we just kind of postured ourselves like, "Hey, we'd love to ask you a question just about living in Cuba." And he said he would need to fill out like
A mountain of paperwork.
right.
There was actually a car that pulled up to watch you guys do this as well. Of
Oh,
other
yeah.
military.
There was a guy trailing us at the park.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
The thing that I didn't know, and I'm still curious about, is you were holding the recorder.
Yeah.
Were you actually recording that part?
Yeah, I recorded the whole thing.
Yes.
Because the other thing is,
so
it's
great.
super illegal to do that in Cuba.
You
Like
guys-
you can't
you guys
take
wanna play
pictures.
a part of it?
Let's play it right now.
Yeah.
Nombre.
Nombre.
Nelson
Nelson.
Fernández.
Okay.
Me llamo David. Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Me llamo David.
¿De dónde tú eres? De Orlando, somos de Florida y ellos son reporteros. Y ellos me tienen-
A mí me da pena cuando es que yo para dar acceso a una entrevista debo pedir permiso.
Sí, eso es lo que yo pensaba.
¿Te das cuenta? Pero mira, aquí hay otra gente que puede preguntarle.
Sí. Y,
Son civiles.
y eso está, y para preguntar a la gente civil, la gente,
Normal.
so, what he indicates is that he wish he could speak to you, but for him to be able to actually have any kind of interview with anybody outside, he would have to get like formal permission from the government. So,
I understand.
Okay, gracias.
muchas gracias, señor.
And who was that exactly?
He is a 3-star general from the Interior Defense Ministry of Cuba. So he's a pretty high governmental individual.
Just walking in the park in Cuba.
The crazy thing is you can't take pictures. Like it's actually illegal to take pictures. I was researching all the stuff later because I was like, it feels like kind of like North Korea light here, where I'm like, there might be some rules that we just don't know that we actually break and get us in serious trouble.
Well,
That was
we're
the
just so
feeling
used to freedom.
Yeah.
That was the feeling I had everywhere. That was like, man, we might break some law that we don't really know. But one of them that I researched later was like things not to do in Cuba, and they said you cannot take pictures or record military.
Well, we were
Like,
going
they will,
around.
They will take all your stuff away. They will probably take you to jail, interrogate you. Like it's like a serious. Don't do it.
I mean, we're just walking around in total grace and freedom that we're used to in America.
Yeah.
Like idiots. But it was awesome. So when I travel to places, you know, it's interesting. At first, sometimes the architecture or the food or whatever, or maybe the art are things that you go for.
Yeah.
You know, you want to go experience these things. But for me, what's most interesting is actually the people.
Yeah.
And we had several conversations, just chance. You know, we went there with no plan at all. There was absolutely no plan from the first moment we got on the plane to the whole time we got home.
And again, we just didn't have time to plan.
I can't emphasize enough how little we thought this through.
I've planned more after the trip than before the trip, and now I'm so sad because there's all these things I want to do.
Yeah, and we experienced some different personalities, like our cab driver. And I got into a conversation with him. We stopped by that bar, and we're just hanging out. And it was a bar that Ernest Hemingway and Marlon Brando and all these people had made famous. They had a plaque on the wall, right, just showing the famous people that used to frequent it. So it was called Two Brothers. And so we sat there.
Dos
and
Hermanos.
Now it's called Dos Hermanos.
There were little bugs crawling on the bar. And then it
Those are
closed
roaches.
down, right, because...
They were.
Well, something happened, and they had to shut the restaurant while we were sitting there.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was.
It was probably that a bunch of loud Americans walked in. They're like, I'm sorry, we're closed.
But I started talking with our cab driver, and he was very, very smart. He considered himself an economist. And
He also looked like a gangster Bruno Mars.
yeah, I noticed there's a picture of him with Chris Toll,
Yeah.
who went with us as our photographer and just general
Yeah,
Panama
check
Jack
our
friend.
Instagram because all his photos are going to be up there in the next few
Jack.
days.
But they had the opposite swoop of their hair. So it was like shaved on one side and swooped over, and our driver had it shaved on the other side and swooped over the other
I didn't
direction.
notice that.
Yeah, it's
It
fantastic.
was the yin and yang.
Of gangster.
But he was just asking, what are you guys doing here? And so I just gave him what I thought was the reason that I was there. And it was just to kind of learn about Cuba and to learn what it's like to be Cuban and to see what Cubans have to offer, you know. And we talked about how in Cuba there are families and people who are uneducated. He's kind of explaining that there are people there who don't have money and they don't have a lot of the freedoms that we enjoy in America, but what they do have is community. And because it comes out of the necessity of needing each other. And there's something that rises up from that in you that actually, even in a place where there is a lack of freedom, there is relationship.
Yeah.
And I found that really helpful because when I'm walking around and thinking about the constraints that are on these people's lives and how challenging that would be to be there long term,
Yeah.
it actually gave me some hope for the people there, because you know, they're in a situation that they can't control, and it may never change in their lifetime.
Yeah. It's like there's unintended consequences, right, of everything. And the unintended consequence of the desperate situation that a lot of Cubans find themselves in is that community, right? And in America, the unintended consequence of, wealth and prosperity
Excess, yeah.
and excess is isolation.
Yes.
So many people here in Orlando are desperately lonely.
Yeah. The sad thing about it here is we are completely free to not be isolated,
Yeah.
but we don't have the knowledge of how to not be isolated.
You know, in Miami, the poor Cuban parts of Miami are like Cuba in that the community aspect.
Yeah.
And the wealthier parts of Miami that are still Cuban, because basically Miami's like 60% Cuban, they still have that aspect of community, but a lot less.
Yeah.
And I think it's dying in those parts of Miami. So you're exactly right.
Well, it's one thing that drives community, if you're not, like, that just naturally drives community if you're not being intentional about it, is need. And America is set up in a way where it's a value to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and not need anything from anyone. That's the value. And so everyone has that goal, and the thing that makes you accomplish that more than anything else is money. If you have money, then you don't need anyone else, and you can provide everything that you need for yourself. But the unintended consequence of that, if you're not intentional, is that it makes you isolated.
Yeah.
You pull into your garage, you shut the door, you don't talk to your neighbors, you just, Netflix and chill. You don't have relationships with people.
Yeah.
What you're supposed to do with your money and your excess is actually to bless other people who have need. And that creates the community.
Not to brag on us, but I think people call us out a lot on how we live, the four of us, including a few other people.
Yeah.
We were just talking about it on the dock the other night, just how somehow God has allowed us to experience this kind of community, even though we're not in poor, desperate situations. Like, we've all been in certain situations where we've had to step in for each other financially or counseling wise, or but it's possible. It's possible to live that way, even if you're not in Cuba.
Yeah.
I think your physical needs basically force that aspect, like your physical need.
Yeah.
But if you posture yourself as a desperate, needy person, because we all are, we're desperate and needy for community, then it's available. You know what I mean?
It is. But the key word I think that you used a second ago is the word intentional. And I remember before we went, we were talking about why are we doing this? And it was about intentionality.
Yeah.
It was about anticipating something and being intentional. And so
being available.
Yeah, so we didn't plan very well.
No.
But we were very intentional about buying the tickets and going and saying, we're going into the unknown. It's probably going to be uncomfortable. And we're okay not knowing exactly what's going to happen. And I think that kind of intentionality can also produce community. Because we actually had community in the midst of that experience.
And there was a lot of us trying to figure out, okay, where do we go next? Who do we talk to? But then there was also a lot of us just sitting at a bar, smoking Cuban cigars and drinking really good rum and just being together. And there were a couple moments where I don't think we said anything. We're just sitting there, just kind of taking it all in. And it's pretty special.
I think the words we used when we were planning, like about this whole connecting aspect, were be present, be available, anticipate, and be intentional. Like, we wrote that on the whiteboard. We're like, these are the postures of our heart we want to exude when we go down there and just see.
I think one incredibly helpful thing in that was that our phones didn't work in Cuba.
Yeah.
Right?
Man, what a break.
What a distraction that thing is.
Yeah.
It's terrible. It's just terrible. It's like tearing households apart.
Yeah.
Because you can walk into anyone's house at like 7:39 p.m. and everyone's on a phone.
Yep.
So let me ask you this. The reason we went down was twofold. Be inspired and gain perspective. So what inspired you about this trip? Wait, before we get there, we're almost missing probably the best part of the trip.
Oh yeah.
Is after we actually got back that night, earlier in the day when we got to the Airbnb, the manager of the place, this guy, what was his name?
Oh, don't say his name.
Okay.
His name was
Yeah.
Beep.
He's 20-something-year-old, and he said, "What can we get you guys?" And I'm like, "Well, do y'all have the option of like cooking dinner?" And he's like, "Yeah, my mom cooks." And it was just saying like, "Well, is your mom a good cook?" And he's like, "The best in Cuba." It's like, okay, well, what can we get? And he's like, "Anything you want." And I think we asked him, we said, "Well, can you make the most like delicious, authentic Cuban meal for us?" And he just started naming things. And we're like, yes. He kept naming things. He was just writing a list of things he would have to get. And
But you were pretty belligerent about avocado.
Oh, yeah. I needed that avocado bad.
I think the
And,
poor guy had to fly to Mexico to get you that avocado.
he asked. So I told him what I wanted.
He can't leave.
It's like $20 for one avocado.
What was crazy was there were 6 of us. And after writing down this whole list, we're like, "So how much do we owe you?" And he's like, it's going to cost you about $10 a person. And we're like, "Done." We'll give it to you right now. And when we got back, we were eating at 9 p.m. and they brought out the spread.
Oh my gosh.
What was y'all's opinion on this meal?
I mean, it was an unending amount of food that kept coming out, and it was all so good.
It was the best Cuban food I've ever had, and I lived in Miami for the better part of like 9 years.
It was like the Cuban food in Miami that I've experienced, but without the greasiness and more tasty.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The beans were the best beans I've ever had in my life.
Mm.
There's some kind of magic in it too, because when we first sat down, I was like, 6 guys are going to crush this food.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's going to be over in 3 minutes because we're all so hungry.
Yeah.
It was somehow bottomless.
Right.
Yeah.
There was as much food on the table when we were
I feel
all
like we kept
stuffed
eating
and in pain.
We kept eating it; it kept multiplying itself.
It was a 2 fish, 5 loaves kind of deal. We're like, I thought I just ate
Well,
a mountain of food.
we would be filled with food and stuff, and then all of a sudden he'd bring out a mango milkshake, and you're like, oh my gosh, you're
We're
drinking.
like hurting, and he's like, "Do you want me to bring you the milkshakes?"
Yeah.
out now we're like, "What?"
And then we're sipping on the milkshakes, trying so hard to finish the milkshakes, like throwing rum in them, doing whatever it takes to get them down. And then he brings out guava, the actual fruit filled with cheese,
Yeah,
which I wanted so badly to eat.
I
But
took one like dime-sized bite, and I was like, "I will actually explode if I eat more."
Oh, I looked over at Chris, and I just saw him trying to drink the milkshake and was just pouring out both sides of his lip. But he wanted it so bad. But yeah, that meal was top 5 of my life.
Yeah.
Just because I think with food, honestly, at the end of the day, it's experience plus taste. And it's like, it was just awesome.
Yeah. They seem to have real joy in serving that to us.
And pride in
Yeah.
their like family recipes and the hospitality they got to show. And
Mm.
those 2 guys hung out with us, way into the night, drinking rum and talking about life.
I think they were kind of taken off guard by that, because I think a lot of tourists go there and they're just like trying to experience it, but we wanted them to be a part of our trip.
Yeah.
We kept saying, "Hey, come sit down," and he's like, "Oh, no. And they're like,
Yeah.
no. Here's your cup of whiskey, a cup of rum. Come hang with us."
Yeah.
And he did.
Yeah, we spent some time late into the night. I was getting very sleepy and just falling asleep during the conversation because
That's not an exaggeration.
our boy liked to talk.
Yeah,
he
he did.
really did, and he would explain things in lengthy fashion.
Well, I don't think he's ever talked to Americans before. I think he was having a good time just learning about politics and.
Do you think this is a good impression?
it's pretty deep. You gotta go like this. You gotta go like that.
No one can see this.
This
They
is
can
really
imagine.
good audio. You can imagine what it's like.
We learned a lot
Oh my
about
gosh.
him that night, and one of the things we learned was that he practices voodoo,
Yep.
and got into a very lengthy conversation about that, and it was neat. We all got to talk about how he got into voodoo because of how powerful it is. He actually experiences real power through it. It's the wrong kind of power, but these dudes who
like these priests, I don't know what you call them, of voodoo, would tell him things about his life that no one knew. He never told anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a really good opportunity to introduce him to the idea that, man, yeah, that stuff is powerful, but Jesus is a billion trillion times more powerful than that stuff. And in fact, he tells me things about people all the time. And he tells me things about myself and about him, and I have grace. Like, he gives us grace. And he talked about, in his religion, what he has to do when he screws up is kneel on rocks for a week and be beaten by a
Yeah, he
Witch doctor or
intentionally
something.
put
Witch
like
doctor.
glass and rocks on his knees and just sat with that, like pushing on it
Yeah.
to actually cause pain for a week straight.
Yeah, it was an interesting conversation, and sometimes I feel like you have to explain the whole gospel because this person's never heard about Jesus. But I really feel like the Lord was telling me, just tell him these things, connect to why he practices voodoo with me. And at the end, we asked him, "Hey, is it okay if we pray for you and ask God to bless you?" And he's got all these dreams, and so we got to pray for him and ask Jesus to reveal himself to him through dreams and speak to him and give him the desires of his heart that God's put in there. It was a cool conversation.
Yeah, I think earlier in season 1 we talked a lot about evangelism and just some of the frustration that I think a lot of us have experienced with the pressure to evangelize and what does that even mean? And we've talked about this idea now of listen, connect, and help. And I felt like we actually really did get to connect with him. What's funny is we may never see him again, probably won't. And we have to trust that God is with him all the time. And that there's this scripture that gives a lot of comfort to me. It says, one plants, one waters, and then God causes the growth. And I'm having to practice that right now with our man.
Well, I really feel like God's going to reveal himself to him.
Yeah. Well, you hear stories of this all the time where God speaks to people in dreams in other places besides America and even here in America.
And even getting into that conversation, we didn't go into this trip saying, "Oh, we're going to go share the gospel with somebody." But just the fact that we lived intentionally. And it's not that we were even trying to do that. I feel like, Pez, you, out of all of us, I think we're all pretty intentional, but I think you're very intentional with everyone you meet. And that just came out naturally on the trip. And it came out naturally for all of us. And through that intentionality and through just getting to know someone's story, you start to recognize, oh my gosh, this person, if they just knew this about Jesus, like if they knew who Jesus was in this way, maybe they would begin to worship him. Because it's the best life possible for them. And it wasn't out of obligation that we shared the gospel. It's because we actually wanted him to experience the kingdom. We wanted him to know Jesus.
All right, so let's go back to the purpose of the trip. Be inspired, gain perspective. Where were y'all inspired?
I was inspired by the people. I know a lot of Cubans, but I've never actually met someone who's living in Cuba. And there's just a vibrancy to those people. And almost everyone we met, everyone's very passionate. And you can see that in the colors of the place, just the colors people paint things, and in the food, and in the hospitality. I was inspired by that. And the architecture. The architecture is just unbelievable. Built by the Spanish hundreds of years ago, and there's something really neat about that.
I think I'm like an artist, always have that perspective and that eye. And just like the beauty and the creativity of the place it's everywhere. I mean, like every single direction you look, it's just beauty and creativity on display. Even in the, like all the cars that Cuba is known for. The creativity that the Cubans go through to keep these cars running and looking cool and, taking people around. I mean, some of their solutions to fix these cars is like insane.
It's like open the hood and
jiggle some stuff. But like they're making their own bondo to like fix whole. I mean, it's like, because they can't, just imagine being in a place where you can't get anything.
Yeah.
They can't order anything. You can't just go online and order a new tail light or a new fender. Like, you can't do that. There is literally no way that they can get a fix for their solution other than to like think outside the box and how they can fix this.
Yeah.
And so that outside the box, how can we fix this thinking is everywhere in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like this pressure cooker of creativity.
Yeah. And just the cobblestone streets and the crown molding in every nook and cranny around every single window. Just massive amounts of work went into making that place what it is now.
And that was old Havana. Because in the other parts of Havana, like the old Havana is the colonial Havana, but the other parts you get into the communist blocks building.
And prefab concrete, pretty bleak.
Yes.
No, super bleak.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there were signs everywhere of what they call the revolution. And it was a revolution. But I was struck by how different that word is to Americans. Just what it means in terms of our culture here versus that culture there.
Their version of revolution led hundreds of thousands of their most creative, influential people to flee.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say about it. I really want to go back.
Yeah, and it's not like, what we're not saying is that America is perfect. In fact, I've been reading some sense about the history of America's relationship with Cuba, and you can really see why there was a lot of angst between Cuba and America. Like the reasons that Cuba, there were people there that severely disliked us with good reason.
Yeah.
I don't think the solution they came up with is good for them.
Right.
But I was inspired by all of these things and really just by what you saw in the Cuban people, like the vitality, and just at 2:00 in the morning, they're still up playing soccer in the street and just having a good time, spending time with each other.
On a Tuesday night.
Yeah. And the other weird thing was that it was a Tuesday and people were just out everywhere. It looked like no one was working and everybody was shopping.
Yeah.
And you couldn't tell where they were going or what they were doing.
Right.
It was like lunchtime on a Saturday, in a busy city.
Yeah.
Be interesting to be there on a weekend.
Yeah.
See what it's like.
Yeah.
Maybe that's when siesta is.
Probably. I think where I was inspired is just making the most out of every moment. I think I was talking about it with Chris Toll while y'all were talking to our guy at night. And it was just like, I want to squeeze every ounce of life out when I have the freedom to do it. It's like, okay, this was a 24 hours set aside to like just go for it, And it's not like, you're going into work and going for it. It's not like you have a Saturday with your family, because usually you want to rest a little bit and whatever. But just what matters and what's important. Because you walk this line of like, how can I get the most for myself out of it? And then how can I actually just be present with other people and as a collective enjoy the most out of it? So I think that was kind of inspiring for me, just to feel like, it's not about me. I have a say in, all that stuff. But just having to share the joy with other people, whether it's you guys or the Cubans, it's just better. It's better than anything for yourself alone. So just, I guess the Christian word's community, but doing it in community and doing, living presently together and not just for individual gain. It's actually, I really could say it's better as a thing together. All right, so what about perspective? Any perspective you're bringing back here?
Well, I have a question for all of us. And what would life here in Orlando, in our communities, in our families, in our city, what would it look like if we lived the way we lived for 24 hours in Cuba?
We'd probably die of sleep exhaustion in a week. But I know what you're saying.
We've definitely run out of money.
We need a lot more money, especially with Eddie shaking hands with dollar bills. Yeah, I think we just it's so easy to lose that intentionality in normal life and just let days slip by. Where, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is just the not having a phone all the time.
Yeah.
That allows you so much to just be present. It's like, what if we just put our phones away for like 2 or 3 hours a day and don't have them on us? Right? We used to go on these overseas mission trips when we were in college, and this is before smartphones and before readily available internet, and no one had a computer that could connect to the internet, and no one had a phone for like 2 months. And the amount of community that was formed in that 2 months was unbelievable. It was like 3 years or 4 years in the States.
But the odd thing about that one trip that we did back in 2004, there was one girl who was connected to her boyfriend back home.
Yeah.
And she missed the whole trip.
Yeah.
All I remember is she was on the phone the entire time. And it's like now all of us are that way every day.
Every day.
So I have some perspective about that because last fall I got a flip phone, and I just did it for 3 months.
Brag.
Yeah, I will brag.
Flip phone brag.
Yeah, so I got a dumb phone on purpose because I was feeling a little disenchanted. And it is amazing just when you don't have the capability to be on your phone, when you actually look up and around, how many people are on their phone. So any shop you go into, if you're waiting in line, if you look over at other cars, everyone's on their phone.
Yeah.
It is an insane
I had a really insane experience recently that was a really eye-opener for this. Is I got called up in probably the worst possible season of my life to do federal jury duty. I was like the busiest I've ever been, and I got the summons, and I had to go in. I was like, I'm for sure going to get out of this. Nope, got called in. And in a federal case, you can't bring any electronics of any kind into the courtroom at all. And so I'm in this courtroom for like a week on the jury, and we kept getting called out for extended periods of time to just go sit in a room. And there's like 9 of us. No one has a phone. No one has a computer. There's nothing to do in this room except talk. So it was this weird like mix of people who are literally your neighbors in a city with nothing else to do. So I just kept asking questions, and like I feel like the people in the room just were really open to having conversations because there's nothing else they could do.
But if they had their phones, no one would talk.
Not a single person would talk.
Yeah. This came up last night when we were just kind of sitting around thinking about today and what we would talk about. And I'm reminded of the word wonder. And I think that's what happens in a 24 hours to live live situation. You should go in with wonder.
Yeah.
Like eyes wide open, ears perked up, like just ready to experience something.
Yeah. Cynicism isn't an option. Well, it is, but it's just not going to be fun at all.
Yeah, but just that quality of wonder is something that I think intentionality can bring into focus and can bring into our lives. How do we cultivate a spirit of wonder in our families and in the communities and even in our places of work? And maybe it has something to do with the phone.
It's almost like the idea I just had is like, what if we created, because we live near this major university, what if we created this space near the university that like you had to check your phone at the door when you came in?
Yes.
It was like a bar or like some kind of social gathering where like you literally have to check your phone to get in.
Yeah.
How do we make it like a communist zone where we just shut down all data once you walk in?
And there's no AC.
There's no AC.
Yeah. Well, I have 2 thoughts about this. When you guys were talking about the phone, and I had this thought of, what if we chose in the moments when we're in line at the supermarket or when we're sitting in a waiting room, what if we chose to put away our phones and just notice what's going on around us? Notice the people, notice the pain, notice the joy, whatever's happening, and just engage with it.
Here's the challenge, though. We can say that because we don't have our phone in front of us right now. But then to remember that in the line, I'll already be in connection with my phone. So it's hard to even... it's like that. This is the challenge of everything. Like the intentionality right now is like we're not on our phone because we're recording a podcast. So it's easy to think, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So to me, it's like how do we... Because it's more than the phone, because the phone is a like very practical thing that would help. But I think to Pez's point, it's just the idea of cultivating wonder. And how do you wake up thinking, I don't want to just survive today. I want to explore today. I want to see what God puts in front of me today. And just have that. I mean, because we're back into the mundane structures and the like to do tasks of every day.
Yeah, well, I think the phone is a natural way to do that, or a way to start.
Sure.
Because if you're creating a habit where you are putting it away in those situations, and you're able to see people for who they are and what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think the second thing that I noticed is just the being together as friends.
Yeah.
And I think it's in our culture, it's really easy to feel like you're a burden on each other, or you're not wanted, or that, you know, it's wrong to want to be with your friends and do things together, like evangelize, like, oh, that's a thing that you do in your personal life when you're on a plane alone. But for me, there's something that comes alive in me and a part of me that really engages with other people when I'm with my friends.
Yeah.
Let's live more like that.
Okay, so what you said about creating an event where we check the phone at the door, that is a very practical and exciting thing for me to think about.
Like people can
And
let's actually just do it.
We have thought of that, like almost that exact thing. Like it's just
it just
confirmation.
Connects. Yeah, it really
that
is.
we should do it.
But it's almost like anyone listening could throw a party where like the rule at the party is you have to check your phone at the door.
Yeah.
Anyone could do that. Like invite your friends over for a party.
I mean, you might have to build like a piece of furniture where you can put people's names on it so they don't freak out.
Yeah.
Put their phone next to their
box.
name.
But they're gonna be like, how do I record this?
Yeah.
How do I show my friends
How do
I'm
I
cool?
Instagram this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you don't.
Well, there's actually
You
cameras
don't.
in the
You have
house.
to be here.
It's like
You
Big
actually have
Brother.
to be here. Yeah.
I think it's a really good, like, it's a good, easy step that could cultivate some of this. But I think the other question that is a much harder question, I don't know that we'll have an answer for this right now, is how do we cultivate that wonder
Yes.
in everyday life?
Right.
Here in Orlando or wherever you live.
Yeah. What's amazing about it is, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, it happens in Cuba. There's wonder there. There's relationship. There's people playing soccer at 2 o'clock in the morning. And what that means is it doesn't matter what your job is. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter if your food is, Prada and Winter Park, or if it's Popeyes. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic status is. The only thing that matters is, am I willing to be intentional? And anyone can do that. We have friends who are stuck in wheelchairs who are sometimes more intentional than we are and living alive in the midst of really deep struggles. And so that actually gives me hope, because that's kind of what Jesus offers us. It's intangible, but you feel its presence when hope shows up in the room, right?
We don't know exactly what season 2 is going to be all about, but it's starting to come together in our minds. And I think Cuba really helped us with that, which is just this idea of intentionality and living this way every day in our city, living in community. And
I think the challenge is going to come to the fact where when you look at Christians in today's culture in America, especially young ones, no one's inspired.
mm-hmm.
No one's inspired. And so
We're bored.
we're bored out of our minds. We don't know what to do to fix that. And then if we think we do, or we read a book that's like, hey, this is how you get inspired, or this is the practical ways to do this, it doesn't fix the deeper issue, is that we do not exude wonder. We want instant gratification. We can't sit in boredom, because boredom leads to like new ideas. Boredom actually leads to freedom, that we're just throwing things in front of our face all the time. And like, that's a big question even for myself going forward, is how are we actually inspired by Jesus? How are we actually inspired by the Spirit? How do we actually live presently in that to exude that out in our lives? Because that is a very common response, the underlying factor with different Christians I talk to, where they just seem stuck. They're not really involved in church. They kind of read the Bible because they feel like they just have not read it for long enough that now they're a bad Christian, so I should do it.
Yeah.
They don't really pray, and they're not hoping for anything.
Well, when the mojo of the church is essentially how fancy and loud and perfect is the worship band,
Yeah.
and how thought-provoking was the teaching, and you walk out. If that's all it is, it's like, well, I can get that on Netflix or
Right.
in my Beats headphones. It sounds better.
Yeah.
You know.
It's like I don't want to try to inspire people without first being inspired myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel that the trip in of itself, now, sure, it's extravagant. We went to Cuba. Who wouldn't be inspired? But then how to cultivate that same inspiration on a day-to-day level
In
here.
your hometown.
Yeah, that's the question.
You know, there is a real issue. There is a real problem, even in our city here in Orlando. The church is very uninspiring to people my age or younger, college students. It doesn't seem like there's much of a union of the different churches in the city. And I think about people my age who are single or even newly married. They're having a hard time finding community. There aren't people who they feel are as serious about their faith as they are, and they can't really find anyone in the center of the city that's living that way. And it's interesting. It's yeah. I don't even know where
I
I'm
have a
going with
question.
that.
So in Scripture, it talks about this. I'm trying to remember where it is, but it's like when you do things so other people can see it, like a Pharisee or whatever, you miss out because you're doing it for the other people to affirm you and approve of you in it, right?
Yeah.
And it mentions Instagram.
It does
Never.
mention Instagram. I think it's in the Gospel of
First
Thomas.
Hezekiah.
That's why they took Thomas out, but that's fine. But that is the culture we live in. It's like we do things just to show other people that we did it.
Yeah.
But what if that was cut off and it really was done in secret to God, being like, Lord, I want to do this for you, and not to brag on myself and not to show other people and get the affirmation from other people. Like,
Yeah, and it's not that Instagram is bad
No.
in and of itself, right?
No.
Because, doing it for record-keeping purposes or whatever, that's great. But the problem is why we're doing it.
right.
I mean,
Like,
Jesus
why am I
literally
on it?
said, "Seek me in secret. I'll be there, and I'll reward what you do in secret." I mean, it's very blatant.
Right.
Jesus says He'll honor our conversations with Him in secret. That means no one knows about them but you and God.
The most inspiring times I've had in normal life, like I'm trying to think through this now, right? Like, how do we get there now in Orlando, not on extravagant, Havana trips? And we talk about this a lot in our community. It's just learning how to hear from God and doing what He says. Those are the most inspirational and the most wonder-inducing times. Because when you hear God's voice and you obey it, what you get in return is joy
Yeah.
and wonder. Because you're like, He's actually, like the God who spoke the universe into existence wants to have a relationship with me and wants me to do certain things.
Yeah.
Right? He created me with good works in mind that He wants me to do. And when I can start getting my finger on that pulse and actually hearing from Him, the result, even in the midst of normal life, is wonder.
Yeah.
I think there's this, it's almost like FOMO that people have that I've experienced a lot too. And you have this question in the back of your mind constantly of like, where is it happening? Right? Where is it? Like, where can I be where it is, where I can be the first to experience it or make sure that I don't miss the fun or the opportunity. And it's an epidemic, and it's tragic.
Yeah.
And the reason it's tragic is because for us, it's not that we went to Cuba to like find God. God is in Cuba.
We did find Jesus.
We did. A very tall statue of Jesus. He had really big eyelashes.
He had immaculate toenails.
He was the Cuban Jesus.
But he's not, it's not that God is any more there than He is right here on this dock where we are right now, or in our office. And I heard this phrase that I've been carrying with me for a while. It's just that God is where you are. He is there. And I think if we carry that into season 2 and into our hometown, man, I think we're going to discover wonder
Yeah.
right here.
Yeah. I think a thread of the Old Testament that I've been thinking about recently is that obedience leads to blessing, that I see a lot in the Old Testament. And on the outset, that sounds very legalistic. And we are so trained as a society right now to be like, grace, 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 grace. That can't be. But it actually makes sense. Like, it's what Dylan's saying. If you do what God says, you actually have joy because we know it's good. God said it because it's good. It's for our benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, it can easily lead into legalism. But there is still the fact that when we just do nothing and we just are like, God's got me, grace, we're not going to experience blessing.
The point of grace is to actually do what God says.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
So that
it's
you
to
can
lead
do.
to the point of it's the motivation of obedience. If the motivation of obedience is self-justification,
Yeah.
that's legalism.
Right.
If the motivation of obedience is joy because King Jesus says this is what's best for you, that's totally different. That is not legalism.
And I think the culture screaming grace, 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 grace isn't actually grace. Because at the root of that is I've given up and I'm just hoping that God likes me.
Yeah.
And he talks about grace, so I'm going to hang on to that. But real understanding grace is falling in love with God because he loves us. And yeah, I like what you're saying, though. I think sometimes we leave that part of Scripture out.
Well, grace is like when we were trying to find the Soma's restaurant, the fake restaurant that didn't exist, and we were chasing something, and we didn't find it because it wasn't there.
Yeah.
And then we asked somebody.
Some random dude.
And then even after you did that, we're standing outside of that place, which looks like nothing from the outside. And I complained to Chris. I was like, this looks like nothing. I don't want to be here. Let's go find some place that's legit, that we don't have to stand here and wait. But then wisdom prevailed in the group. Right? You looked at me. You were like, calm down. I was like, okay.
You're hungry.
And then Eddie's over here
You're
greasing
hot. Calm
palms.
down.
And in the quote-unquote doing what God said, which was like right there in community, we waited, and then all of a sudden we got led into this secret place and had a delicious meal, and we got entertained and just really enjoyed each other's company. And it's a lot like the people who were just on the outside taking pictures of the place didn't experience what doing what God says looks like. I'm trying to make an analogy out of this story, but it's like we got ushered in through like patience and just doing what God said and kind of waiting and not having instant gratification. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it's a lot of that kind of lack of intentionality in obeying God that we miss out on the meal.
I had a pretty major realization about grace this week too. I'm a verbal processor, and so when I'm talking with people, I'm like, it really helps me to think through things. But I was talking with a friend who has just like a terrible father. I mean, it's like the worst father. And like she's struggling with how do I show this person grace? And the realization I came to is grace is available, but it's not. The difference is to get grace, the person it's available to has to actually receive it. You don't get grace just because it's like thrown at you. You get grace because you actually admit that you're wrong and receive grace. Mm-hmm. And until you admit you're wrong, you actually don't get grace. What you get is law and judgment and hell.
Injustice, yeah.
Injustice. That's what you get. But it's available to you. So it's like extending grace to someone is not, how do I get them to get grace? It's like it's available to you, but to get it, you have to admit how deeply wrong you are. And you will not get it until then. What you get until then is judgment and hell on earth.
And what you're hitting on is repentance is the only way you get grace.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it's there and it's available.
Mm-hmm.
Man, Jeremy, you asked about what perspective we got. It was kind of that was a pile of perspective that we just got.
Could do this in the two parts.
Yeah. Well, here from Havana Club, I guess we're going to sign off now because we've been talking for a long time. But I'm very much excited about Season 2 and what it means to take this first step of creating a space where you have to check your phone. Yeah. That's what I want to do right now.
Yeah. And if you want to see pictures and videos from our trip in Cuba, you can just go to our Instagram. Our friend Chris Toll is an incredible artist and photographer.
and it was so cool just having him with us. We didn't have to think about taking photos. He just did it for us.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, tell your friends about the podcast because season 2 is coming soon, and we'd love to have more people join us on this journey, chasing down the abundant life.
Also, it's summer. What's your summer vacay plans? I mean, how are you going to be inspired? How are you going to gain perspective? Because it's worth it. Get out of your normal routine. That's what people...
24 hours.
For 24 hours. Let us know... Uh-huh.
Put your phone down.
Put your phone down. Go somewhere for 24 hours or longer and tell us...
Yeah, then pick your
what's
phone
happening.
back up and tell us what happened.
Yeah.
Dana Rockmore from Dinner Party Project, she's doing it for 2 months, and we'll check in with her throughout the summer.
I hope... I know everyone's in different positions, financially, socially, economically. But if you have a chance, just get outside your comfort zone, get outside your routine, and gain some new perspective and get inspired.
Yeah. The colors of the world are out there, even when it's hard to see them.
Well, you heard it from Philosopher Chris. We're signing off. Adios, amigos.
Muchachos.
Ciao.
Adios.
We're really excited because season 2 of the Live Alive podcast is coming up in a few weeks, and we'll be exploring a lot more of how to chase down the abundant life in our own cities. So make sure to stay tuned. In the meantime, you can follow us on Instagram at Let's Live Alive.